So this is our podcast, and we're going to be talking about the poem On First Looking into Chapman's Homer by John Keats. John Keats was born in 1795 and was an English romantic poet and author of 3 poems considered to be among the finest in the English language. He was one of the key figures in the second generation of the Romantic movement, despite the fact that his work had been in publication for only 4 years before his death. He died of tuberculosis, and his last request was to be placed under an unnamed tombstone which contained only the words, en pentameter, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water."
In this particular poem, Keats used the form of an Italian sonnet where there are 2 main chunks. Basically, the first part is composed of an octet and the second part is a sestet. We thought of this octet in the sonnet as Keats' experience before he read Chapman's Homer, and in the sestet is his interpretation of his emotions after he read it. As you listen to the poem or follow along, notice the shift in tone at the end of the octet.
So the meter in this poem is iambic pentameter. As you can see by the picture we provided, all are iambs, besides the first, which is a spondee. Iambic pentameter is very popular in the poetry world.
Alright, here's some background information about Cortez, Homer, and Chapman, who Keats addresses in the poem. Hopefully this will help you guys better understand the poem. Alright, so Cortez was a Spanish conquistador who went on an expedition to Mexico in the early 16th century, though he was not the first. Vasco Núñez de Balboa was the first European to lead an expedition to the New World. So then there's Homer. Homer is the author of the Iliad and Odyssey and is revered as the greatest ancient Greek epic poet. These epic poems have enormous influence on history of literature. And last we have Chapman. Chapman was an English dramatist, translator, and poet. Chapman is the best remembered for his translation of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey.
Here's some vocab you might need to know before we read the poem. Bards, a person who composed and recited epic or heroic poems.
Fealty, the obligation to be faithful to a lord.
Demesne, possession of land as one's own.
Ken, knowledge or understanding.
Surmise, to think or infer without certain or strong evidence, like a guess.
On first looking into Chapman's Homer, much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So basically, the entire poem is describing his reaction to reading Chapman's translation of Homer. Keats starts off the poem by stating his vast knowledge of poetry and literature, and he talks and how he's talked to different poets who are equally as experienced as he is in poetry, and that's basically what the 3 first lines are talking about.
Then he talks about Homer and how he's well known for his writing, and also states that Homer was above the rest, like the best of his time. But Keats never really grasped what was so great about Homer's writing until he read Chapman's Homer.
Then there's a shift in the poem. We know this for 2 reasons. 1, because it's an Italian sonnet, and 2, because Keats uses then, which indicates a shift in the poem.
In this final sestet, Keats is now explaining his reaction after he's read Chapman's translation. He initially uses a metaphor of an astronomer discovering a new planet in order to emphasize his awe of reading this piece of literature.
Alright, so now we're going to break down the literary devices in the poem, starting with alliteration. We found oft of one in the poem. It's an example of alliteration because of the repetition of the O sound.
Another literary device is overstatement. The example we found was one wide expanse. This is overstatement because Keats uses the word expanse, which already indicates vastness, but by adding wide, he creates exaggeration in the poem.
Personification is another device we discovered in Keats' poem. An example that we found was when a planet swims into his ken. This is personification because a planet cannot swim into someone's understanding in real life.
The next device that we're going to talk about are allusions. We noticed a few allusions in the sonnet. The first that we saw referred back to the times and myths of the ancient Greeks. He mentions Apollo in the very beginning of the poem. Apollo is actually the Greek god of poetry and song. Seeing as the poem relates to the works of Homer, who is a famous Greek poet, the mentioning of Greek mythology fits perfectly. The second allusion we notice referred to Cortez towards the end. Cortez was a famous explorer that discovered the Pacific Ocean. Keats uses Cortez in a well-developed metaphor in order to help support his overall theme of the sonnet. Keats creates a tone of awe and astonishment in the poem, and it's especially brought out in the sestet, which is where he really talks about the way he felt after reading Chapman's translation. Specifically in lines 9 and 10, he says, "Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken." Basically, in these two lines, he's comparing himself to an astronomer when they first discover a new planet. We can only imagine the way an astronomer would feel if they just discovered a new planet. They'd be filled with amazement and wonder and excited about this new discovery, which is basically how he felt. The metaphor allowed the audience to have a better understanding about the emotions he felt after reading Chapman's translation. And the use of this metaphor perfectly captured the feelings he felt. He develops this tone throughout the entire poem, and he's basically just praising Chapman for creating this translation of Homer, that he was able to have a different perspective on it than when he read the original works of Homer. The next literary device that we're going to talk about is understatement. We only found basically one example, or what we think is an example of understatement. It's the last line in the poem, and it says, "Silent upon a peak in Darien." So basically, we thought this was understatement because throughout the entire poem, Keats is telling the audience, his excitement about discovery, and in each, sort of example that he uses, he emphasizes the excitement part of a discovery. When Cortez discovers the Pacific, he says that all of his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, and they're like, you'd expect them to be excited about discovering the Pacific, but then he says silent as a key action that Cortez does, which seemed like understatement to us because we wouldn't think that you'd be, silent if you just discovered the Pacific Ocean. So we thought that was an example of understatement in the poem.
We found multiple symbols in the poem. One was realms of gold, which is a symbol of literature. He states how he has traveled much in these realms, suggesting he is well read. Another was Apollo. He is the symbol for poetry and how bards are loyal to him.
The last thing we're going to talk about are the romantic characteristics of the poem. The first romantic characteristic we found is the past, which is revealed by Keats using Apollo and Cortez. The second one we found is nature, which is shown by when he says eagle eyes. The third is feelings, and is revealed when he says, "Then felt I like some watcher of the skies." And the last romantic characteristic we found was imagination, and this is shown by the line, "When a new planet swims into his ken."
Thanks for listening to our podcast.